Elvas to Marinha Grande, September 4th, 2025. Here we are leaving the hotel. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you might have noticed that the center of the roundabouts in Portugal here are often a source of pride for the cities and towns in which you find them. Everywhere you go, there's something happening within them, from the simplest of flower gardens to extremely elaborate sculptures. The municipalities go all out here. In Elvas, in this particular roundabout, they've gone with an impressive fountain. There's the significance of using water in this way, since Elvas is in a very dry area of Portugal and is dependent upon the water brought by the Amoreira aqueduct. Here we are driving up the Rua 14 de Janeiro, or the 14th of January road. The road is honoring the Battle of the Lines of Elvas of 1659, a major event in the Portuguese Restoration War, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And here we are driving through the As Portas de Elvas, or the doors to the old town. There's multiple sets of these as you're going up the hill. In Portugal, there's a waving culture on these one-lane or limited space areas where people drive their cars. The rule of the road is roughly that whomever has noticed the other person in the oncoming car first will pull over and allow the other person to pass. As they do so, they wave an acknowledgement and you wave back. If it's a tie, or one person has a more obvious option to pull over, they do so and the same waving happens. If someone needs to back up significantly, one of the people points to themselves and begins to back up, allowing the other to pass. More waving ensues. And then there are people who just drive like they own the road and they stop for no one, and if you dare challenge them, they'll roll their window down and yell at you. That hasn't happened to me personally, but I have seen it done. Here you can see one of those where this gentleman backed up and allowed me to pass so I could go to the next porta. And that's how we entered the city. Okay, the Portuguese Restoration War. Let's talk about that for a minute or two. First, it's important to know that the Moors, coming up out of North Africa, occupied and ruled all of the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years. The first wave of the invasion occurred in the year 711 CE. The conquered peoples of Portugal were able to force the Moors out earlier than the Spanish actually did. The Moors were driven out of Portugal in the year 1232 CE, while Spain didn't drive them out until 1492, which you may recall was a pretty busy year for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. From the year 1232 until 1581, the Portuguese kingdom was restored and self-governed. There was a succession crisis in 1578 when the last Avis king, Sebastian, died, and quickly following him, so did his grand-uncle, the Cardinal Enrique, leaving no clear heir to the Portuguese throne. King Philip II of Spain was part of the Habsburg dynasty, and therefore the Portuguese crown fell to him, making him not just King Philip II of Spain, but also King Philip I of Portugal. This represented the unification of the Iberian Peninsula under one leader. One thing to note about the Iberian Peninsula, it has a long history of being ruled by various groups. From the Visigoths to the Celts and the Romans to the Moors, it has been a place of constant conflict. Throughout all of this, most of the actual ruling was done in the various regions, with each having their own monarch or ruler. Because of that loose structure, it was easier for invading armies to overlay a centralized government, at least at first. I give this background because linguistically, the Iberian Peninsula is separated not just by accents or dialects, but actual languages that don't necessarily respect the borders. For example, on the western coast of Spain, a language called Occitano is spoken. It's related to the Catalan language of Barcelona and Catalunya, but it's also spoken in Valencia and even in southern France. On the eastern side, they speak Gallego in Galicia, which is north of Portugal, and there are a lot of similarities between Gallego and Portuguese. I'm going to cut myself off here because for those who know me, you know that I can talk about languages of the Iberian Peninsula for hours. So back to Portuguese restoration. In December of 1640, a group by the name of the 40 Conjured led a revolution to overthrow Spanish rule. They placed John IV, the first king of the House of Braganza, on the Portuguese throne. It took 28 years of skirmishes and battles, but in 1668, the Treaty of Lisbon formally recognized Portugal's independence from Spain, and the two countries have remained as they are ever since. Perhaps you didn't expect an in-depth history lesson here. I can honestly say I hadn't planned to get this deep into it myself, so it was a surprise to both of us. Portugal's connection with cork dates to ancient times. Archaeological findings suggest that the Iberians used cork as early as 3000 BCE. However, it wasn't until the 18th century that cork production became an organized industry here. Portugal is the largest cork producer in the world, followed by Spain. The cork oak trees grow mainly in the southern part of the country, approximately the lower third, to be a little bit more precise. There are an estimated 70 million cork trees in Portugal, primarily located in the Algarve, Alentejo, and Ribatejo areas. The cork tree cannot be harvested until it's at least 20 years old. After the bark is harvested, the tree won't be ready to be harvested again until another 9 to 12 years have passed. The trees themselves can live up to beyond even 200 years. When the bark has been harvested, the drying sap turns the trunks a deep reddish brown. As we're driving through these trees, if you slow the video down, you'll see the trunks that have been recently harvested because they look almost like a chocolate brown. So why is cork popular? It is 100% recyclable, biodegradable, very light, elastic, compressible, resilient, and impermeable to liquids and gases. It is also fire retardant, highly abrasion resistant, and provides a very high level of thermal and acoustic insulation. Portugal has a cork industry with many offshoots. The obvious use for it is the wine produced in the country, corking the bottles. And besides the wine, wherever the cork grows, a local craft has been developed, such as the making of hand-produced bags, belts, key rings, boxes, and dozens of other items that are typically sold in fairs and markets all over the country. On an industrial scale, Portugal's vast amount of high-quality cork is graded into around 50 different categories for a wide variety of uses, which include floats, soundproofing, containers for radioactive materials, beehives, insulation boards, and last but not least, bottle stoppers. Portuguese cork is also used in aircraft for gaskets, in the automobile industry, in the girders of buildings, ventilation ducts, and even in the air conditioning systems of nuclear submarines. Here we are entering the town of Évora, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are 55,000 people who call Évora home. The city's history can be traced back 5 millennia. It was known as Évora by the Celts, who made it their regional capital. The town's name itself comes from the Celts and means "of the yew trees." The Romans conquered the town in the year 57 CE, and there are parts of the city walls that still stand today, as you can see that we're driving by some here. The Visigoths conquered the town in 584 CE, and the city was named a cathedral city. In the year 715 CE, the town was conquered by the Moors and was under Muslim rule until 1165 CE. In 1166, the town was once again under full Portuguese rule and King Alfonso I. Here we're about to go over the 25th of April Bridge. The bridge is meant to look like the Golden Gate Bridge. It was designed by the same company as the Oakland Bay Bridge and then was painted in the same color as the Golden Gate Bridge. So it will look familiar to people who are from the United States and maybe other places as well. It is honoring the Carnation Revolution, which happened on April 25th, 1974. And this was when the Portuguese military overthrew the Salazar dictatorship that had been in place since before the Second World War. Unfortunately, both Spain and Portugal were the victims of fascist authoritarian governments for decades, which both fell in within a year of one another. Portugal through the revolution, and Spain with the death of Francisco Franco. Both countries installed representative democracies, and Spain still has a monarchy, unlike Portugal. The Spanish monarchy, however, doesn't control the country. It's much more of a figurehead type role. This bridge leads us right into Lisbon, and this was the day after the devastating funicular accident that killed 17 people. We're approaching the Mosteiro dos Jerónimos, or the Geronimos monastery in Lisbon. It's near the Tagus River, and it became the necropolis of the Portuguese royal dynasty of Avis in the 16th century. was later secularized on the 20th of December 1833 by state decree, and its ownership transferred to the charitable institution Real Casa Pia de Lisboa. The construction of the monastery and church began on the 6th of January 1501 and was completed roughly 100 years later. The Jerónimos Monastery is one of the most prominent examples of the late Portuguese Gothic Manueline style of architecture in Lisbon. It was erected in the early 1500s near the launch point of Vasco da Gama's first journey, and its construction was funded by tax on the profits of the yearly Portuguese India Armadas. In 1880, da Gama's remains and those of the poet Luís de Camões, who celebrated da Gama's first voyage in his 1572 epic poem, the Lusíada, those were moved to new carved tombs in the nave of the monastery's church, only a few meters away from the tombs of the kings Manuel I and John III, whom da Gama had served. In 1983, the Jerónimos Monastery was classified as UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the nearby Tower of Belém. You may not have been able to see the line waiting to enter the building, but the wait time was well over 2 hours, so we opted for multiple drive-bys to fully appreciate the architecture. We had also planned to go to the Tower of Belém, but it was under renovation and the entire exterior was covered by scaffolding and plastic sheeting. It's worth noting that there was a massive earthquake in Lisbon in 1755. The quake itself, along with subsequent fires and a tsunami, almost completely destroyed Lisbon. Seismologists estimate that the earthquake had a magnitude of 7.7. An estimated 30 to 40,000 people perished, along with another 10,000 in Morocco. As the first earthquake studied scientifically for its effects over a large area, it led to the birth of modern seismology and earthquake engineering. Here we're in the heart of Sintra, or a Ville de Sintra. With a population over 385,000, Sintra is one of the most urbanized and densely populated municipalities in Portugal. The historic center of Sintra is famous for its 19th century Romanticist architecture, historic estates and villas, gardens, and royal palaces and castles, which resulted in the classification of the town as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Sintra's landmarks include the medieval Castle of the Moors, the Romanticist Pena National Palace, and the Portuguese Renaissance Sintra National Palace. In this part of the video, we're making our way to the Pena National Palace, which is a red and yellow castle that is instantly recognizable by anyone interested in visiting Portugal who's done any bit of research on places to see and things to do. You cannot see the palace from the road, unfortunately, although we tried. We also didn't stop to go into the palace because, again, the wait times were hours long and we had other things on our itinerary. earliest remnants of human occupation in this area were discovered in Peñaverde, linked to an occupation dating to the early Paleolithic. Other remnants were discovered in an open-air site in São Pedro de Canfarim, alongside the chapel of the Castelo dos Mouros, or the Moorish castle, with these dating back to the Neolithic period. The sites include ceramics and microlithic flint utensils dating back to the 5th millennium BCE, over 7,000 years ago. This is us trying to find our way to the Castelo do Óbidos. We can see it, but the signage quickly stops, and we were never clear about where to go to park and to actually visit it. So we ended up driving around trying to find somewhere where we could actually see the entrance. There was nothing, so we ended up leaving the city and going to our next destination, but not for a lack of trying. And obviously, here you can see the walls of the castle. It could be that we could have continued up this street, but there were people walking on it and looked like people were parking. So, and as you can clearly see, no signage whatsoever, which is why we gave up. So, an interesting point though about the castle, we're along here, one of the walls. Um, at one point in time, the entire city was within the walls of the castle, but by the 14th century, the city had outgrown it. The castle was first constructed between the years 600 and 700 CE, with the addition of towers up and until the 1300s. So there was a lot of modifications over time. Regardless, the city continued to expand outside of the walls and has a long history of being again occupied by the Visigoths, the Celts, the Romans, the Moors, and so you can see a mixture both in the buildings that we're passing here, but also still in the castle, which you can see in the upper left there, some of the towers. The Manueline style, the Romantic style, the Mudéjar style of the Moors, it all comes together here in this town.